Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. It happened on a quiet spring evening, the kind of evening where the house feels warmer than usual, not because of the temperature, but because of the laughter and chatter filling the dining room. My son had invited his friend, Daniel, to stay for dinner. They'd been close since high school, and even now, in their late 20s, that friendship had grown into something steady and admirable. I'd always liked Daniel. Polite, kind, with a thoughtfulness that most young men his age didn't seem to carry. The table was still cluttered with the remains of dinner, plates pushed aside, glasses half filled with water, the faint smell of roasted chicken and rosemary hanging in the air. My son had excused himself to take a call, promising to be right back. It was supposed to be a few minutes, but those minutes stretched longer than either of us expected. That's when Daniel and I were left sitting alone, facing each other across the table, the ticking clock on the wall filling the silence. At first, we exchanged the kind of small talk that feels safe. He told me about his new job, how the city was wearing him out, how he missed the quiet of our small town. I listened, nodding, occasionally glancing at the kitchen window where the last bit of sunlight painted the trees gold. There was something calming about his voice, steady, honest, almost reflective. Then his tone shifted slightly, softer, more personal. "You know," he said, resting his hands on the table, "I always felt comfortable here. Your home has this peace to it." I smiled, taken aback by the sincerity in his tone. "I'm glad you feel that way," I said. "I always try to make it feel warm. Too many homes lose that these days." He nodded. "My place doesn't feel like that. I guess warmth isn't something you can buy. It's something people bring with them." His words stayed in the air for a moment, as though the room itself was holding on to them. There was something about the way he said it, not sad, not longing, just truthful. And that truth settled somewhere deep inside me. I'd spent years making this house feel alive after my husband passed away, filling it with light, laughter, and memories, so that my son wouldn't grow up feeling the emptiness I sometimes felt. Hearing that from Daniel, a guest who had no reason to flatter me, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't expected. We talked a little more, about music, about how quickly time passes, about how people change without realizing it. At one point, I noticed how the sound of my son's voice hadn't yet returned from the other room. I thought about calling out to him, but something told me to stay, to listen. Daniel's eyes had that reflective kind of sadness that only appears when someone has something on their mind. "I think people underestimate how much others carry," he said. "Everyone assumes you're fine if you smile, but sometimes even strong people just need someone to notice." There it was, a truth I'd lived by but rarely heard spoken aloud. I looked at him, this young man who had eaten at my table since he was a boy, now speaking with the calm wisdom of someone who'd seen the weight of life. "Daniel," I said softly, "that's something I've learned too. And noticing. It's one of the most powerful things you can do for someone." He smiled then, a quiet, knowing smile. The kind that tells you the conversation meant something real. My son eventually returned, and the moment shifted back into the rhythm of the evening. Laughter, dishes clinking, the door closing as Daniel left with a wave and a thank you. But after they'd gone, I stood for a long time in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the fading scent of dinner. His words lingered like a melody that refuses to fade, gentle, honest, and true. That night, I realized that sometimes the most unexpected conversations can open a small window inside you, one that reminds you that kindness, awareness, and warmth still matter, even in a world that moves too fast. And as I turned off the lights, I whispered to myself, people don't stay forever, but their words do. Those words, his words, still linger. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. The sun hadn't fully climbed over the trees yet, and a soft golden light filled the kitchen. I stood there, holding my cup of coffee, listening to the faint chirping of birds outside. It was peaceful, yet my mind kept replaying fragments of the previous night. Daniel's voice, his calm honesty, the way his words seemed to echo long after he'd left. I've had countless conversations in this kitchen, but few had left that kind of mark. Maybe it was because I saw a reflection of something familiar in his thoughts, that quiet endurance people carry when they don't want to burden others. It reminded me of myself years ago, after my husband passed, when silence became both my comfort and my cage. Later that day, my son came downstairs, cheerful and oblivious, talking about his plans with Daniel for the weekend. He laughed about something from the night before, and I smiled along, though my mind was elsewhere. I found myself asking, almost without realizing it, did Daniel get home safely? Yeah, he texted me, my son said casually. He said to tell you thanks for dinner. He really enjoyed it. Something about that made me smile. I didn't think much of it at first, but by evening, when the house was quiet again, I caught myself looking at the chair where Daniel had sat. The way he'd leaned forward, his eyes thoughtful, his voice steady. It all came back so vividly, like a moment that hadn't quite ended. That weekend, my son invited Daniel over again. I didn't expect it to happen so soon, but when the doorbell rang and I saw him standing there, holding a small bunch of flowers, daisies, my favorite, I was genuinely taken aback. These are for you, he said, almost shyly. To thank you for dinner the other night. You didn't have to listen to me ramble about life, but you did. I laughed softly, touched by the gesture. Oh, you weren't rambling. You spoke from the heart, and that's something people don't do often enough anymore. He smiled, and for a second it felt as if time slowed. There was no awkwardness, just mutual respect, an unspoken understanding between two people from different stages of life who both knew what it meant to carry quiet stories. During dinner, he was his usual polite self, joining in on jokes, helping clear the table afterward. But later, when my son left to meet another friend briefly, Daniel lingered once more. He offered to help me dry the dishes, and we worked side by side in comfortable silence. You know, he said after a while, his voice gentle, I've been thinking about what we talked about that night, about noticing people. I guess I realized I don't do that enough, especially with my own family. I nodded slowly. Awareness takes effort, I said, but it's never too late to start. Sometimes just asking someone how they really are can mean more than we think. He looked at me with that same thoughtful expression. You made me realize that. It was such a simple moment, but the sincerity in his words carried weight. I could feel the depth behind them, the kind of gratitude that comes from being understood, not just heard. When my son returned, the house filled again with laughter and chatter, but something quiet remained between Daniel and me. Not unspoken attraction, but connection. The kind that bridges generations and makes you see that kindness, when shared, becomes something lasting. After they left, I stepped outside onto the porch. The evening air was cool, the stars faint above the trees. I breathed deeply and felt something I hadn't felt in a while. Not sadness, not longing, but peace. Because sometimes the most unexpected people remind you that what you give, your time, your patience, your listening, doesn't disappear into the air. It plants roots quietly, and someday it blooms in someone else's life. And that night, as I turned off the porch light, I found myself whispering again the same thought. His words still linger, but now they brought warmth instead of ache. The following week passed quietly, yet something subtle had changed in the air around the house. I found myself humming while cooking, glancing at the clock in the evenings, half expecting to hear the familiar knock at the door. My son noticed my lighter mood and teased me for it, though he didn't know the reason. It wasn't Daniel himself that filled my thoughts. It was what his presence had awakened in me. That reminder that genuine human connection still existed, even in small, passing moments. One afternoon, my son mentioned that Daniel might stop by to drop something off. I didn't think much of it until I heard the soft knock later that evening. When I opened the door, there he was, holding a small paper bag and wearing that same gentle smile. "I brought something," he said, lifting the bag. "It's just some pastries from the bakery near my office. I remembered you said you like almond croissants." It was such a small thing, but it caught me off guard. People rarely remember the little details you share in conversation, yet he did. I thanked him and invited him in, setting out tea while we talked. The sun was setting, casting a soft amber glow across the living room, and the conversation flowed easily, about work, about life, about how unpredictable adulthood can feel. Then the tone shifted just slightly, the way it always did when Daniel began to open up. He told me how distant he'd been feeling from his parents lately. "They're good people," he said, staring at the cup in his hands. "But it feels like we speak different languages now. I can't tell if it's them who've changed or if I have." I listened carefully, my heart tightening in quiet understanding. "Sometimes distance doesn't come from disagreement," I said softly. "It comes from time. We forget how to see each other the way we used to." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "That's exactly it," he said finally. "You have this way of putting things that make sense of feelings I couldn't even describe." His words reached deeper than he probably intended. It wasn't flattery. It was recognition. I'd spent years learning to articulate emotions that no one else seemed to understand after loss, after loneliness, after rediscovering myself. Maybe that was why Daniel felt comfortable here. Maybe the house and my presence gave him something familiar, something human and steady. We sat in silence for a bit, sipping our tea. Outside, the street lights flickered on, one by one. He leaned back slightly and said, almost in a whisper, "You know, I don't really talk like this with anyone. Most people don't want to listen." I smiled gently. "That's not true, Daniel. People do want to listen. They just don't always know how." He nodded, smiling faintly, though his eyes looked far away, like he was reflecting on something long unspoken. There was a vulnerability there, quiet but unmistakable. And I realized in that moment that this young man wasn't seeking advice. He was seeking connection, the kind that feels genuine and safe. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the doorway. "You've helped me more than you probably realize," he said, "just by listening." I felt a warmth rise in my chest, the kind that doesn't need words. "And you've reminded me of something too," I said softly, "that every generation still has the same hopes, the same fears. We're not so different after all." He smiled, that quiet, sincere smile that always seemed to hold more meaning than he let on. "That's good to know," he said before stepping out into the cool night air. I watched from the doorway as he walked down the path, the porch light tracing his figure until he disappeared into the darkness. The night was calm, but my heart wasn't empty. It felt full, alive in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. And as I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, I understood something simple yet profound. Sometimes life gives us these unexpected encounters not to change us completely, but to remind us of the parts of ourselves we thought had gone quiet. His visit had done just that. And though I didn't know it then, that evening would lead to one final conversation between us, one that would stay with me forever. It was a week later when Daniel came by again, unannounced this time. It was early evening, and the sky was painted in soft shades of lavender and gold. I was watering the small garden by the porch when I saw him walking up the path, hands in his pockets, a calm but distant look on his face. "Hi," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," I replied, setting the watering can down. "You know you're always welcome here." He smiled faintly, but there was something different about his eyes, something contemplative, almost heavy. I invited him in, and soon we were sitting in the living room, the soft ticking of the old clock filling the pauses between our words. "I needed to talk to someone," he said finally, and I didn't know who else to call. I nodded for him to go on. "My father and I had an argument," he said, sighing. "It wasn't even about anything big, but it just brought up everything we never really said to each other. I think I realized how much we both hold back, trying not to disappoint one another." His honesty hung in the air, raw and real. I could see the ache in his expression, the ache of wanting to be understood by someone you love and finding only distance. "Daniel," I said softly, "sometimes love doesn't look like understanding. Sometimes it's just quiet endurance. Parents and children, we often love in different languages." He looked at me, eyes steady but glistening. "Maybe, but it still hurts." "I know," I whispered. "It always does when we care deeply." For a moment we sat without speaking. The evening light filtered through the curtains, turning the room golden, almost sacred. I could see how much he was trying to make sense of his own emotions, and in that silence I realized something profound, that I wasn't just offering comfort to him. I was rediscovering the power of empathy that had once carried me through my own pain. He finally smiled, though it was a weary smile. "You always make things feel clearer. I wish more people saw the world the way you do." I chuckled softly. "Clarity comes with time, Daniel. And with listening. You're learning that faster than most." We spoke for a long while after that, not just about family, but about the choices that shape who we become. He listened intently, asking questions that showed he wasn't just hearing my words, but really absorbing them. There was a deep respect in how he spoke, as if he knew the conversation itself mattered more than the answers. When it grew late, he stood up reluctantly, as though he didn't want the evening to end. "I don't think I ever told you this," he said, "but you've helped me see people differently, including myself. You reminded me that listening isn't just kindness, it's connection." I felt a lump in my throat. "That means a lot, Daniel. More than you know." He hesitated before adding, "I'll be moving soon. The new job's taking me across the state, but I wanted to say thank you before I go." For a moment, I couldn't find my words. I just nodded and smiled, even as my heart tightened. "Then I suppose I'll have to let you go chase that new chapter," I said gently. "But remember, kindness doesn't end with distance." He smiled, that same warm, honest smile I'd come to know so well. "I won't forget that." After he left, I stood by the window, watching his car disappear down the quiet street. The porch light glowed softly, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a strange mix of gratitude and melancholy. In the weeks that followed, I'd sometimes glance at that same chair he always sat in, remembering his thoughtful words, his laughter, his sincerity. It wasn't sadness that lingered. It was appreciation. The kind that grows from knowing that a simple human connection, born from conversation and empathy, can leave an imprint far deeper than we expect. And now, whenever I find myself alone in the evening, I still think about that night after dinner, about the young man who stayed a little longer than planned, and whose words still linger. Because sometimes it's not grand moments or lifelong relationships that shape us. It's the unexpected souls who pass through our lives, reminding us that being seen, truly seen, is one of the rarest gifts of all.